The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Phoenix as Dr. Marcus Webb hurried through the sliding doors of Phoenix General Hospital, his CDC identification badge swaying against his chest with each urgent step. The call had come at 5:47 a.m., jolting him from sleep with words that made his blood run cold. Multiple patients, aggressive behavior, unknown pathogen. 23 years of epidemiological experience had taught Marcus to expect the unexpected, but nothing had prepared him for what he discovered in the hospital's isolation ward. The first patient, a 42-year-old construction worker named Jimmy Martinez, lay strapped to a gurney, his skin an unnatural grayish pallor that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. His eyes, once brown according to his medical chart, had turned a milky white that reflected the fluorescent lights like those of a dead fish. Yet those eyes tracked movement with an intensity that sent chills down Marcus's spine, following every person who entered his line of sight with predatory focus. 3 miles away, Jake Rodriguez adjusted his hard hat and checked his watch as he arrived at the downtown construction site where he'd worked for the past 8 years. His buddy Tommy Kellerman was already there, sitting on a stack of concrete blocks and staring off into the distance with an expression Jake had never seen before. "Hey, Tommy, you feeling all right, man?" Jake called out, approaching his co-worker who had called in sick the previous day after what he described as a crazy encounter with some homeless guy who bit me. Tommy turned slowly, and Jake stopped mid-stride when he saw his friend's face. The usual warm smile was gone, replaced by a vacant stare, and Tommy's skin had taken on a sickly gray tone that made him look like he'd been dead for days. When Tommy opened his mouth to respond, only a low growl emerged, followed by a clicking sound that reminded Jake of an insect. Back at the hospital, Marcus reviewed the mounting cases with growing alarm. In the past 18 hours, 17 patients had been admitted with similar symptoms. All had suffered bite wounds from individuals described as acting strangely. All were showing signs of rapid cellular decay while maintaining motor functions, and all were exhibiting violent tendencies that required physical restraint. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the attending physician, pulled Marcus aside with trembling hands. "Marcus, I've been practicing medicine for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Their vital signs are inconsistent with life, yet they're moving, they're aware, and they're incredibly strong." Patient 0 in room 4 broke through leather restraints that should hold down a bodybuilder. Marcus nodded grimly as he studied the test results that defied everything he knew about human physiology. The patient's blood work showed massive cellular breakdown, yet their nervous systems remained highly active in ways that shouldn't be possible. The situation escalated dramatically when Tommy lunged at Jake without warning, his movements jerky and unnatural, but surprisingly quick. Jake barely managed to dodge, stumbling backward as his friend of 8 years snapped his teeth where Jake's neck had been moments before. "Tommy, what the hell?" Jake shouted, but the thing that had been Tommy showed no recognition, only hunger in those dead white eyes. Construction workers throughout the site began shouting as Tommy pursued Jake with relentless determination, his decaying hands reaching out with fingers that had turned black at the tips. Jake grabbed a crowbar from his toolbox and swung it defensively, the metal connecting with Tommy's skull with a sickening crack that would have dropped any normal person. Instead, Tommy staggered for only a moment before resuming his attack, dark fluid leaking from the wound but showing no signs of pain or deterrence. At Phoenix General, the nightmare reached a crescendo when patient 0, Jimmy Martinez, somehow slipped his restraints during a shift change. Nurse Rebecca Walsh entered his room for a routine check and found herself face-to-face with something that should have been impossible. Jimmy stood beside his bed, the leather straps hanging in shreds around his wrists, his hospital gown stained with fluids that smelled like death itself. When Rebecca screamed, Jimmy moved toward her with purpose, his mouth opening to reveal teeth that had somehow become sharper, more predatory. The attack happened so quickly that the security cameras barely captured it. but the aftermath sent shockwaves through the entire medical facility. Within minutes, Rebecca had joined the ranks of the infected, her transformation beginning even as medical staff tried desperately to treat her wounds. Marcus watched the security footage with growing horror as the situation spiraled completely out of control. The infected patients, now numbering over 30, had somehow coordinated their escape from the isolation ward, moving through the hospital corridors with what could only be described as pack behavior. They weren't mindless monsters. They were hunting with strategy, cutting off exits and working together in ways that suggested retained intelligence. As Marcus initiated emergency protocols and called for military assistance, reports began flooding in from across the Southwest. Phoenix wasn't alone. Similar outbreaks were occurring simultaneously in Las Vegas, Albuquerque, Denver, and dozens of smaller cities, painting a terrifying picture of coordinated infection that suggested something far more sinister than a natural pandemic. The last image Marcus saw before evacuating Phoenix General was of the infected streaming out of the hospital's main entrance, spreading into the city streets where unsuspecting citizens went about their morning routines, completely unaware that their world was about to change forever. 24 hours after the first confirmed outbreak, the fabric of American civilization began unraveling at an unprecedented pace as reports flooded in from every major metropolitan area across the nation. Former Army Sergeant Emma Walsh pressed her face against the reinforced window of her third-floor Denver apartment, watching in stunned silence as the tree-lined streets below transformed into scenes from humanity's darkest nightmares. Her military training kicked in automatically as she assessed the tactical situation, noting how the infected moved in loose formations rather than random chaos, suggesting they retained some level of cognitive function that made them exponentially more dangerous than traditional disease victims. The creatures shambled through the morning light with purpose, their gray-tinged skin glistening with an oily substance that seemed to repel the autumn sunshine, while their milky white eyes scanned the environment with predatory intelligence that sent chills down Emma's spine. 800 miles southeast in Atlanta, Jefferson High School had become a fortress of desperate survival as chemistry teacher Robert Kim barricaded classroom doors with desks and chairs while his remaining students huddled together in terrified clusters. The infection had swept through the school with devastating efficiency during second period, transforming teachers and students alike into something that defied rational explanation. Robert's survival group now consisted of star quarterback Devin Mitchell, whose athletic prowess had proved invaluable in navigating the infected-filled hallways, honor student Ashley Freeman, whose quick thinking had helped them avoid several close encounters with the transformed, and maintenance supervisor Carlos Gutierrez, whose intimate knowledge of the school's layout had saved their lives multiple times. Outside their makeshift sanctuary, the sounds of chaos echoed through the corridors as the infected searched for prey with systematic determination, their footsteps creating an ominous rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the survivors' racing heartbeats. Dr. Marcus Webb established emergency communication protocols with CDC facilities nationwide from his makeshift command center in a Phoenix military installation, and the reports he received painted a picture so dire that even his extensive experience with pandemic scenarios hadn't prepared him for the scope of the catastrophe. The infection demonstrated a perfect mortality rate followed by reanimation within 2 to 6 hours of death, creating an exponentially expanding army of the undead that overwhelmed every containment protocol in the emergency response playbook. Military units across the country reported that standard quarantine procedures were failing catastrophically as the infected showed unexpected problem-solving abilities, using tools, opening doors, and even working together to breach defensive perimeters in ways that suggested the pathogen enhanced rather than destroyed certain cognitive functions. Emma watched through her apartment window as her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, stumbled out of her house, her floral dress now stained with dark fluids that definitely weren't coffee. The sweet grandmother who had baked cookies for the entire building just days earlier now moved with jerky, unnatural motions, her head tilting at odd angles as she tested the air like a predator tracking scent. When Mrs. Patterson's infected eyes locked onto Emma's window, the creature didn't simply stare blankly as one might expect from a mindless zombie. Instead, she studied the building's exterior with calculating intelligence, examining potential entry points and testing door handles with methodical precision that suggested retained memory of how human dwellings functioned. Emma's blood ran cold when she realized that Mrs. Patterson was systematically working her way around the building, apparently remembering which apartments were typically occupied and focusing her attention on those locations. Robert's group faced their own horrifying revelation when they discovered that the infected retained enough motor skills to manipulate simple mechanisms, watching in terror as transformed faculty members worked together to operate the school's main entrance doors. Principal Jackson, whose morning announcements had been a comforting constant for 3 years, now stood among the infected with his tie still perfectly knotted, but his face bearing the characteristic gray pallor and milky eyes of the transformed. What made the sight particularly disturbing was that Principal Jackson seemed to recognize the importance of the school's PA system. Standing near the main office, as if he remembered his administrative duties, but lacked the complex cognitive functions necessary to actually operate the equipment. Ashley Freeman whispered urgently to the group that they needed to find alternative exit routes because the infected were clearly learning to adapt their hunting strategies. The situation deteriorated further when emergency broadcast signals began failing across major metropolitan areas as power grids collapsed under the weight of abandoned facilities and infrastructure damage caused by the chaos of the outbreak. Dr. Webb received confirmation from military commanders that the infection had reached critical mass in over 40 major cities, with confirmed cases now numbering in the hundreds of thousands and growing exponentially as emergency services became overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the catastrophe. National Guard units reported that traditional crowd control methods were proving ineffective against infected populations that seemed to adapt to defensive strategies within hours of encountering them. The infected weren't just mindless eating machines. They were learning, evolving their approach to hunting living humans with each encounter. Emma made the difficult decision to abandon her apartment when she realized that Mrs. Patterson had somehow communicated the building's layout to other infected in the area. Watching in horror as a group of nearly 20 transformed individuals began converging on her location with coordinated precision. She grabbed her military-issued survival kit and the hunting rifle her father had left her, knowing that her army training in urban warfare might be the only thing standing between her and joining the ranks of the undead. As she prepared to leave everything familiar behind, Emma caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and realized that the woman staring back at her was no longer the off-duty soldier who had been worrying about paying rent and dating prospects just 48 hours earlier. She was now a survivor in a world where humanity itself hung in the balance. The emergency broadcast system crackled to life one final time with a message that would haunt survivors for years to come. Martial law is now in effect nationwide. Seek immediate shelter. Do not attempt to help infected individuals. Consider all government services suspended until further notice. Then the signal died, leaving only static and the growing sounds of civilization's collapse echoing through the empty streets. 3 weeks after the initial outbreak transformed American society into a desperate struggle for survival, scattered groups of the living had begun emerging from their hiding places to face the harsh realities of a world where the dead refused to stay buried. Emma Walsh crouched behind the rusted remains of an overturned school bus, her military-trained eyes scanning the abandoned interstate highway that stretched endlessly toward the Rocky Mountains. Her survival group had grown from a lone wolf operation into a tight-knit family of 5 unlikely companions who had learned to trust each other with their lives on a daily basis. Tony Castellanos, a soft-spoken mechanic from East Denver, had proved invaluable in keeping their salvage vehicles running despite the scarcity of proper parts and tools, while former police officer Linda Patterson brought law enforcement experience that helped them navigate the dangerous politics of survivor encounters. The most surprising addition to their group was Harold Hank Morrison, a 73-year-old retired park ranger whose wilderness survival skills and encyclopedic knowledge of edible plants had kept them alive when traditional food sources ran out. The infected, whom survivors had universally begun calling walkers due to their distinctive shuffling gait, had evolved in ways that made them far more dangerous than the mindless zombies of popular fiction. Emma had documented their behavior patterns in a worn notebook, noting that they hunted primarily through sound detection and scent tracking, but retained enough cognitive function to solve basic problems like opening doors, climbing stairs, and even using simple tools when pursuing prey. Most disturbing was their apparent ability to communicate with each other through a series of clicks, groans, and guttural sounds that seemed to coordinate group movements during hunting expeditions. The walkers showed no signs of decomposition beyond their initial transformation, maintaining their physical strength and motor skills indefinitely while displaying an inexhaustible hunger for living human flesh. 400 miles southeast, Robert Kim's school-based survival group had established a temporary sanctuary in an abandoned Costco warehouse on Atlanta's outskirts, where the high ceilings and multiple exit points provided both security and escape options. Their original group of 4 had expanded to include several other survivors they had rescued during dangerous supply runs, most notably Diana Torres, a registered nurse whose medical skills had saved multiple lives, and her husband Miguel Torres, a Marine Corps veteran whose combat experience complemented Robert's leadership abilities. Diana was 7 months pregnant, adding both hope and vulnerability to their group dynamic as they struggled to create a safe environment for bringing new life into their nightmarish world. Ashley Freeman had taken charge of inventory management and rationing, while Devin Mitchell used his athletic abilities to scout potential threats and safe routes through walker-infested territory. Dr. Marcus Webb, now operating from a heavily fortified CDC facility in Colorado Springs, had made several breakthrough discoveries about the infection's nature and spread patterns. His research indicated that the pathogen was unlike any naturally occurring virus or bacteria, displaying characteristics that suggested possible artificial engineering or extraterrestrial origin. The infection attacked the brain's higher cognitive functions while leaving motor control and basic hunting instincts intact, essentially creating predatory humans with diminished empathy and reasoning abilities, but enhanced aggression and stamina. Most critically, Webb had determined that the infection was 100% fatal in humans, with no known cases of natural immunity or recovery once the transformation process began. The greatest threat to survivor communities wasn't always the walkers themselves, but other humans who had abandoned moral constraints in their desperation to survive. Emma's group had their first encounter with organized bandits when they attempted to scavenge supplies from a pharmacy in what had been the peaceful suburb of Lakewood. The raiders, led by a charismatic and ruthlessly pragmatic man named Vincent Cross, had established a brutal hierarchy based on strength and intimidation, taking whatever they wanted from weaker survivor groups and leaving death in their wake. Cross had somehow gathered nearly 50 followers who shared his philosophy that traditional morality was a luxury humanity could no longer afford, and they had begun systematically hunting down smaller survivor groups to steal their resources and recruit their strongest members. Vincent Cross represented everything that Emma had sworn to fight against during her military service. A predator who exploited chaos and fear to build his own twisted empire among the ruins of civilization. Their confrontation at the pharmacy had ended in a tense standoff when Emma's group demonstrated they were better armed and trained than Cross had anticipated. But the raider leader's parting words haunted her dreams. "You can play soldier and pretend the old rules still matter, but this is Darwin's world now, sweetheart. Only the strongest survive, and I plan to be the strongest." The encounter forced Emma to confront uncomfortable truths about leadership in desperate times, wondering if maintaining her moral principles was a luxury that might get her people killed. Robert's group faced similar moral dilemmas, when they discovered another survivor community that had resorted to sacrificing weaker members to distract walker herds while the stronger survivors escaped with supplies. The practice was horrifically effective from a purely survival standpoint, but represented the kind of moral compromise that Robert refused to accept regardless of the practical benefits. Miguel Torres supported Robert's stance, arguing that abandoning their humanity made them no better than the walkers themselves, while Carlos Gutierrez worried that their moral standards might prove to be fatal disadvantages in a world where others had abandoned such constraints entirely. The tension between survival and morality reached a breaking point when both survivor groups independently received radio transmissions about a rumored safe zone in Colorado Springs, where military forces and scientists were supposedly working together to establish a secure community and develop a cure for the infection. The broadcasts promised safety, medical care, and the chance to rebuild civilization, but also warned that the journey to reach the safe zone was extremely dangerous and that many who attempted it were never heard from again. As walker herds grew larger and more coordinated in their movements, and as human predators like Vincent Cross became increasingly bold in their attacks on survivor communities, the choice between staying put and risking everything for a chance at real safety became the defining decision that would determine not just their survival, but the kind of people they would become in this new world where every choice carried life or death consequences. The crackling radio transmission that reached both survivor groups on the same rain-soaked Tuesday evening would change everything, carrying with it both the promise of salvation and the specter of impossible choices that would test every principle they held sacred. Emma Walsh adjusted the frequency dial on their salvaged military radio while her companions gathered around their makeshift camp in the abandoned visitor center of Rocky Mountain National Park, listening intently as a clear, professional voice cut through the static with news that seemed too good to be true. This is Colonel Bradley Morrison, United States Army, broadcasting from Haven Point Facility in Colorado Springs. We have established a secure perimeter with full military protection, medical facilities, and scientific research capabilities. Any surviving American citizens are welcome to attempt passage to our coordinates, but be advised that the journey is extremely hazardous and we cannot guarantee safe arrival. The transmission repeated every hour on the hour, providing detailed coordinates and describing a community of over 200 survivors who had successfully created a functioning society within fortified walls. Robert Kim's group received the same transmission in their Atlanta warehouse, where Diana Torres sat heavily on a makeshift bed constructed from shopping carts and sleeping bags, her pregnancy now advanced enough that every movement required careful consideration. Miguel Torres held his wife's hand while the others debated the merits of attempting a cross-country journey through walker-infested territory, their voices hushed but intense as they weighed the desperate risks against the tantalizing possibility of real safety. Ashley Freeman had spent the past week calculating travel routes and supply requirements, concluding that their group would need to traverse nearly 800 miles of hostile territory while protecting a pregnant woman who could give birth at any moment. Carlos Gutierrez expressed concerns about leaving the relative security of their established base, pointing out that they had learned to navigate the local walker populations and established reliable scavenging routes that kept them fed and supplied. The decision became more urgent when both groups encountered evidence that Vincent Cross's raider organization had expanded far beyond their original expectations, with reports from other survivors indicating that Cross now commanded a mobile army of over 150 fighters who traveled in armored vehicles and systematically destroyed any community that refused to submit to their authority. Emma's group discovered the aftermath of one such attack when they investigated smoke rising from what had been a thriving survivor settlement near Boulder, finding only charred buildings and evidence that Cross's raiders had executed anyone who resisted while taking the rest as slaves or forced recruits. The brutality of the scene was matched only by its tactical efficiency, suggesting that Cross had evolved from a simple bandit leader into something approaching a warlord with military-level organizational capabilities. The two survivor groups' paths converged in the most unlikely of circumstances when Emma's team responded to distress signals from what they assumed was another raider attack, only to discover Robert's group defending Diana during the early stages of labor, while surrounded by a walker herd that had been attracted by her screams. The abandoned hospital where they had sought shelter for the birth had become a death trap when structural damage allowed walkers to breach their defenses, forcing the survivors into a desperate running battle through corridors filled with medical equipment and the infected remains of staff and patients. Emma's military training proved invaluable as she coordinated defensive positions while Tony Castellanos and Miguel Torres worked together to clear escape routes, their different backgrounds creating an unexpectedly effective combat partnership. The birth of Diana's daughter in the hospital's defunct maternity ward represented both the highest hope and greatest vulnerability their combined group had ever experienced, as the miraculous arrival of new life occurred against a backdrop of death and destruction that threatened to overwhelm their defenses at any moment. Diana named her daughter Hope Torres, a declaration of faith in humanity's future that seemed almost defiant given their circumstances, while the baby's first cries echoed through halls where walker moans provided a constant reminder of how precarious their situation had become. Harold Morrison used his wilderness medical knowledge to assist with the delivery, while Linda Patterson and Devin Mitchell maintained perimeter security, creating a protective bubble around the miracle of birth in a world where such moments had become impossibly rare. The combined group's escape from the hospital required split-second timing and perfect coordination as they moved Diana and newborn Hope through walker-infested corridors while fighting a running battle that tested every survival skill they had learned. Robert Kim found himself making life-or-death tactical decisions that his teacher training had never prepared him for, while Ashley Freeman's quick thinking about hospital layout helped them avoid several potentially fatal encounters with large walker groups. The successful evacuation strengthened bonds between the two groups and demonstrated that their combined skills and resources made them far more capable than either group could have been alone, leading to an unanimous decision to merge into a single 30-person community with shared leadership and resources. The sight of military helicopters on the horizon as they emerged from the hospital complex seemed like divine intervention, confirming that the radio transmissions about Haven Point were genuine and that salvation might actually be within their reach. However, the helicopter's flight path also revealed the massive scope of the walker herds moving across the landscape, with thousands of infected individuals streaming toward population centers in coordinated migrations that suggested some form of collective intelligence guiding their movements. As Emma watched the aircraft disappear toward Colorado Springs, she realized that reaching Haven Point would require not just surviving the journey itself, but understanding and outmaneuvering walker behavior patterns that seemed to evolve more sophisticated strategies with each passing day. The birth of Hope Torres had given their group renewed purpose and determination, but it had also added a vulnerability that would make every mile towards safety exponentially more dangerous, forcing them to balance their protective instincts against the calculated risks that survival in their new world demanded. The massive steel gates of Haven Point opened like the doors to salvation itself as Emma Walsh's convoy of survivors approached the heavily fortified entrance, their vehicles bearing the scars of a harrowing 2-week journey through walker-infested territory that had tested every survival skill they possessed. The underground military complex stretched deep into the Colorado mountain range, its entrance protected by electrified fencing, automated weapon systems, and a perimeter guard of battle-hardened soldiers who moved with the confident precision of troops who had successfully defended their sanctuary against countless attacks. General Patricia Hayes, a stern-faced woman in her 50s whose gray hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, personally greeted the new arrivals with a mixture of genuine warmth and military efficiency that immediately established the complex social dynamics governing life within Haven Point's protected walls. Dr. Marcus Webb's research laboratory occupied an entire level of the underground facility, where banks of computers analyzed data streams from monitoring stations across the former United States, while teams of scientists worked around the clock to understand the infection's mechanisms and develop countermeasures. His latest findings painted a picture both more hopeful and more terrifying than anyone had anticipated, revealing that the pathogen demonstrated remarkable adaptability that allowed it to evolve defenses against traditional medical interventions, while simultaneously showing vulnerabilities to specific environmental conditions that might be exploited. The infection's response to extreme cold temperatures suggested that the organisms required certain optimal conditions to maintain their aggressive hunting behaviors, while electromagnetic interference at particular frequencies seemed to disrupt their coordination abilities in ways that could potentially be weaponized. Haven Point's population of over 400 survivors represented a cross-section of American society that had been forced to adapt to communal living under quasi-military governance, creating tensions between civilian residents who valued democratic decision-making and military personnel who prioritized security and efficiency above all other considerations. The Civilian Council, led by former Mayor Jennifer Walsh and retired Professor David Chun, advocated for establishing educational programs, recreational activities, and democratic voting procedures that would help maintain morale and psychological health among the survivor population. Meanwhile, General Hayes and her military staff argued that such luxuries were dangerous distractions from the constant vigilance required to maintain their defensive perimeter against both walker herds and human raiders, who periodically tested their defenses. Emma quickly discovered that Vincent Cross's raider organization had evolved into a far more sophisticated threat than anyone at Haven Point had initially realized, with intelligence reports indicating that Cross now commanded a mobile army of over 300 fighters who operated from a network of fortified bases across the former Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming territories. Cross's forces had adopted tactics that combined traditional military assault strategies with psychological warfare designed to break the morale of survivor communities, using captured civilians as human shields and broadcasting the sounds of torture over radio frequencies to demoralize their targets before launching attacks. Most disturbing were reports that Cross had begun capturing and experimenting on walkers, apparently attempting to develop methods for controlling or directing their movements against enemy settlements. Robert Kim struggled to adapt to Haven Point's structured environment after months of making independent survival decisions, finding himself caught between gratitude for the safety the facility provided and frustration with regulations that seemed to prioritize order over individual freedom. His experience as an educator proved valuable when he was assigned to establish schooling programs for the 47 children living within the complex, but he battled with post-traumatic stress that made it difficult to focus on lesson plans when his mind kept returning to the horrors they had witnessed during their journey. Ashley Freeman thrived in Haven Point's organized environment, volunteering for multiple committee assignments and quickly establishing herself as an advocate for survivor rights within the complex's governance structure. Diana Torres's recovery from childbirth proceeded smoothly within Haven Point's well-equipped medical facilities, but the challenges of raising an infant in an underground military complex created unexpected psychological pressures that affected not just her family, but the entire survivor community. Baby Hope became a symbol of future possibilities that lifted morale throughout the facility. Yet her presence also highlighted the precarious nature of their situation and the enormous responsibility they bore to create a world worthy of the next generation. Miguel Torres found purpose working with Haven Point's defensive teams, his Marine Corps training making him an invaluable asset in training civilian volunteers and maintaining the complex's weapon systems. The relative security of Haven Point was shattered when long-range reconnaissance teams reported massive walker herds converging on their general area, with aerial surveillance confirming that over 10,000 infected individuals were moving across the landscape in coordinated formations that suggested external guidance or control. The herds moved with purpose rather than the random wandering patterns that had characterized walker behavior in the early days of the outbreak, following specific routes that seemed designed to probe the defenses of known survivor settlements. Dr. Webb's analysis of the movement patterns revealed disturbing correlations with radio transmissions that had been intercepted from Cross's raider bases, suggesting that the criminal organization had somehow developed methods for influencing or directing walker movements as part of their military strategy. The discovery that someone was actively herding walkers toward Haven Point transformed the facility's atmosphere from cautious optimism to urgent preparation for siege warfare, as General Hayes implemented emergency protocols that turned every resident into a potential defender regardless of age or civilian status. Emma found herself appointed to the facility's war council despite being a recent arrival, her combat experience and knowledge of Cross's tactics making her indispensable to Haven Point's defensive planning. As the walkers drew closer and radio intercepts confirmed that Cross's raiders were indeed coordinating the attack, the survivors realized they faced not just another battle for survival, but a deliberate attempt to destroy the last organized resistance to Cross's expanding empire of chaos and brutality. The thunderous roar of Vincent Cross's armored convoy shattered the dawn's silence as hundreds of raider vehicles charged across the Colorado Plains toward Haven Point, their engines creating a mechanical symphony of destruction that could be heard for miles across the abandoned landscape. Emma Walsh stood on the facility's observation deck, watching through high-powered binoculars as Cross's forces deployed with military precision that spoke to careful planning and professional tactical training, establishing firing positions on the surrounding hills while simultaneously driving massive walker herds toward the complex using modified sound equipment mounted on armored trucks. The coordination between human attackers and undead hordes represented a nightmarish evolution in warfare that transformed the battlefield into a three-way conflict where traditional defensive strategies became obsolete overnight. General Patricia Hayes had transformed Haven Point into a fortress bristling with defensive capabilities, but even her extensive military experience hadn't prepared her for an enemy who used the infected as living weapons while maintaining disciplined fire control and strategic positioning. The facility's automated defense systems engaged Cross's vehicles with devastating effect, but the raiders had learned from previous encounters and deployed countermeasures that neutralized many of Haven Point's technological advantages, while their walker herds absorbed defensive fire that would have been directed at human targets. Dr. Marcus Webb monitored the attack from his laboratory, frantically adjusting the electromagnetic frequency generators he had developed to disrupt walker coordination, discovering to his horror that Cross's forces were using competing frequencies that seemed to override his defensive systems. Robert Kim found himself thrust into a combat leadership role he had never wanted, organizing civilian evacuation procedures while trying to maintain some semblance of educational routine for the children who looked to him for stability in a world gone mad. The underground complex's multiple levels provided natural defensive positions, but the psychological impact of being trapped underground while battles raged overhead created panic among civilians who had thought themselves safe from the horrors of the outside world. Ashley Freeman demonstrated remarkable composure under fire, establishing communication networks between defensive positions while coordinating supply distribution to ensure that ammunition and medical supplies reached the areas where they were most desperately needed. The siege's most devastating moment came when Cross's raiders launched a coordinated assault on Haven Point's main entrance while simultaneously detonating explosives that they had somehow planted near the facility's power generation systems during previous reconnaissance missions. The explosions plunged sections of the complex into darkness and compromised air filtration systems that kept the underground environment habitable, forcing defenders to choose between maintaining defensive positions and protecting the life support infrastructure that sustained their entire community. Carlos Gutierrez made the ultimate sacrifice during this crisis, manually operating the backup power systems while Walker hordes poured through breached security barriers, staying at his post to restore critical systems even as the infected overwhelmed his position. Emma coordinated defensive operations from Haven Point's command center, her military training proving invaluable as she directed counter-battery fire against Cross's artillery positions while simultaneously managing the complex logistics of defending against both human attackers and Walker herds. The facility's defenders discovered that fighting walkers and human enemies simultaneously required entirely new tactical approaches, as strategies effective against one type of threat often proved counterproductive when facing the other. Linda Patterson led a heroic defense of the facility's medical wing, where Diana Torres and other non-combatants sheltered with their children, holding off waves of infected that had breached the outer perimeters through damaged ventilation systems. General Hayes made the difficult decision to authorize the use of Haven Point's most closely guarded secret weapon, a prototype electromagnetic pulse device that Dr. Webb had developed to disable Walker neural functions on a massive scale, despite warnings that the device had never been tested under combat conditions and might cause catastrophic damage to the facility's own systems. The weapon's activation created a spectacular light show visible for miles as electromagnetic energy cascaded across the battlefield, temporarily disorienting both Walker herds and electronic equipment used by Cross's forces. However, the victory came at a terrible cost when the device's power requirements overloaded Haven Point's main reactor, causing a cascade failure that left the facility running on emergency power with no prospect of restoration. The battle's turning point arrived when Tony Castellanos led a desperate sortie to repair critical infrastructure damage while under fire from both raiders and walkers, his mechanical expertise proving essential to restoring defensive systems that had been damaged during the initial assault. Miguel Torres distinguished himself by organizing counter-sniper operations that eliminated several of Cross's most effective marksmen, using his Marine Corps training to turn Haven Point's observation posts into deadly firing positions that made approach routes impassable for Raider infantry. Devin Mitchell's athletic abilities proved crucial during high-speed evacuations of wounded defenders, his speed and agility allowing him to reach injured personnel in areas too dangerous for slower rescuers. Vincent Cross himself appeared on Haven Point's communication channels during the siege's climax, his voice carrying across emergency frequencies with offers of mercy for those willing to surrender and join his expanding empire of controlled territory. Cross revealed that he possessed detailed intelligence about Haven Point's defenses and population, suggesting that he had been planning this assault for months while placing infiltrators within the survivor community to gather strategic information. The revelation that Haven Point had been compromised from within created paranoia and mistrust among defenders who suddenly questioned whether their neighbors might be working for the enemy, adding psychological warfare to the physical battles raging throughout the complex. As explosions echoed through the underground corridors and Walker moans mixed with human screams, the survivors realized that their sanctuary had become a battlefield where victory would require sacrifices that would fundamentally change the nature of their community, assuming any of them survived to see another dawn. The desperate plan that would either save Haven Point or destroy it entirely began taking shape in the facility's damaged command center, where Emma Walsh studied tactical maps by emergency lighting while the sounds of ongoing battle echoed through the reinforced walls above their heads. Dr. Marcus Webb's electromagnetic frequency research had revealed a crucial weakness in the coordination between Cross's raiders and their Walker herds, suggesting that properly calibrated sonic devices could not only disrupt the infected's hunting patterns, but actually redirect them toward new targets with devastating effectiveness. The counterattack would require volunteers to venture beyond Haven Point's protective barriers while under fire from both human enemies and potentially hostile walkers, carrying portable frequency generators to specific coordinates where they could turn Cross's own weapons against him. Robert Kim overcame months of accumulated trauma and self-doubt to volunteer for the most dangerous aspect of the mission, leading a team that included Devin Mitchell and Miguel Torres through the facility's damaged ventilation systems to reach the surface without alerting Cross's forces to their intentions. His experience as an educator had taught him to think strategically about complex problems while maintaining calm under pressure, skills that proved invaluable when planning escape routes through territory controlled by enemies who had demonstrated tactical sophistication far beyond typical raider organizations. Ashley Freeman coordinated communication between strike teams while maintaining contact with other survivor settlements that had agreed to provide diversionary attacks against Cross's peripheral bases, creating a multi-front engagement that would stretch raider resources and prevent them from concentrating their full strength against Haven Point. Dr. Webb's breakthrough discovery came at the most critical moment of the siege, when his analysis of captured raider communication equipment revealed that the electromagnetic frequencies used to control walker behavior were actually weakening the pathogen's hold on infected neural tissue, suggesting that prolonged exposure might reverse the transformation process in recently infected individuals. The implications were staggering. The technology they were using as a weapon against their enemies might also represent the first step toward developing an actual cure for the infection that had destroyed civilization. However, implementing the frequency treatment on a large scale would require modifications to their equipment that could only be accomplished under battlefield conditions while fighting for their lives. The counterattack began at dawn with coordinated strikes against Cross's communication networks, as Tony Castellanos led a team of mechanical specialists in sabotaging the raider vehicles that had been abandoned during the previous night's fighting. Their success in disabling Cross's mobile command center created confusion among raider forces who suddenly found themselves unable to coordinate their attacks with the walker herds, leading to friendly fire incidents as panicked raiders engaged infected that they could no longer distinguish from enemy combatants. Harold Morrison used his wilderness survival expertise to guide strike teams through terrain that Cross's forces had assumed was impassable, allowing Haven Point's defenders to establish firing positions behind enemy lines. The battle's turning point came when Miguel Torres made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure that the sonic devices activated successfully, staying behind to defend the equipment against a massive walker surge while his teammates escaped to safety. His Marine Corps training and fierce determination to protect his newborn daughter gave him the strength to hold his position until the electromagnetic pulse generators came online, sending cascading waves of disruptive energy across the battlefield that turned the coordinated walker attack into chaotic confusion. The sight of thousands of infected suddenly turning on Cross's raiders created a terrifying spectacle that demonstrated the awesome power of the technology they had developed, while also showing the moral complexity of using such weapons against human enemies. Diana Torres made the agonizing decision to leave baby Hope in Haven Point's protected nursery while she joined the medical teams treating wounded defenders, her nursing skills proving essential when the facility's medical staff became overwhelmed by casualties from the ongoing battle. Her choice represented the transformation that the apocalypse had forced upon ordinary citizens, turning a new mother into a combat medic who could function effectively while explosions shook the underground complex and the sounds of warfare echoed through the corridors. The psychological impact of her decision rippled through the entire survivor community, demonstrating that everyone would need to make sacrifices if humanity was to survive its darkest hour. Vincent Cross's forces began retreating as their walker allies turned against them, but the raider leader himself proved far more dangerous when cornered than anyone had anticipated, launching a series of desperate counterattacks that targeted Haven Point's most vulnerable points with surgical precision. Cross had clearly studied the facility's layout extensively during his infiltration operations, directing artillery fire against structural weak points that caused cascading damage throughout the underground complex. Linda Patterson led the defense of Haven Point's main entrance when Cross's elite guard attempted a final assault designed to breach the facility's central command areas. Her police training in crisis management proving invaluable as she coordinated civilian evacuations while maintaining defensive positions. The victory over Cross's forces came at a devastating cost in lives and infrastructure, but also demonstrated that organized survivor communities could successfully resist even the most sophisticated human threats when they worked together with determination and tactical intelligence. The battle established communication networks between Haven Point and 6 other major survivor settlements across the former western United States, creating an alliance that would prove crucial for rebuilding efforts and mutual defense against future threats. Robert Kim's successful leadership during the counterattack helped him overcome his post-traumatic stress while establishing his reputation as someone who could be trusted with life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. As the last of Cross's vehicles disappeared over the horizon and the surviving walkers wandered aimlessly without coordination signals to guide them, the defenders of Haven Point realized they had achieved something unprecedented in the post-apocalyptic world. A decisive victory that proved humanity's capacity not just to survive, but to reclaim territory and rebuild civilization from the ruins of the old world. The warm afternoon sunlight streaming through the reinforced windows of Haven Point's expanded cafeteria illuminated faces that bore the scars of survival, but also carried expressions of genuine hope as Emma Walsh addressed the assembled community council 6 months after their victory against Vincent Cross's Raider army. The underground military complex had grown into a thriving settlement of over 800 survivors, with new arrivals coming weekly from across the former United States as word spread through survivor radio networks about the successful community that had proven human civilization could not only endure but flourish in the post-apocalyptic world. Emma's transition from military survivor to elected civilian leader represented the democratic evolution that Haven Point had undergone, balancing security needs with the human desire for self-governance while maintaining the disciplined efficiency that had enabled their survival during the darkest days of the siege. Dr. Marcus Webb's revolutionary breakthrough in electromagnetic frequency treatment had transformed from a battlefield weapon into a beacon of hope for humanity's future, with his laboratory now producing portable devices that could prevent infection if administered within 6 hours of exposure to the Walker pathogen. The treatment couldn't reverse existing infections or resurrect the dead, but it offered survivors something that had seemed impossible just months earlier: the ability to venture into Walker-infested territory with dramatically reduced risk of joining the ranks of the infected. Webb's research teams had established communication with scientific communities in 12 other survivor settlements, creating a collaborative network that accelerated research and development while sharing critical discoveries that benefited all of humanity's remaining strongholds. Robert Kim stood before a classroom filled with 43 children ranging in age from 5 to 17, teaching them not just traditional academic subjects, but also the practical skills they would need to rebuild civilization, while never forgetting the lessons learned during humanity's darkest chapter. His curriculum included everything from basic mathematics and literature to survival tactics and community governance, ensuring that the next generation would be both educated and prepared for the challenges they would inevitably face. The children's laughter echoing through Haven Point's corridors served as a powerful reminder that life continued despite the horrors that surrounded them, while their questions about the world before the outbreak kept alive the memory of what they were fighting to restore. Haven Point's expansion beyond its underground origins had created a surface community protected by electromagnetic barriers and patrolled by well-trained security teams who had learned to coordinate their movements with the Walker control frequencies that Dr. Webb's devices generated. The settlement now controlled over 50 square miles of reclaimed territory, including agricultural areas where crops grew under the protection of automated defense systems and livestock grazed in pastures cleared of infected threats. Tony Castellanos had established a workshop complex where mechanical skills were taught alongside traditional crafts, ensuring that the community could maintain and expand its infrastructure while preserving the knowledge necessary for long-term technological development. Ashley Freeman's governance initiatives had created a democratic system that balanced individual freedoms with community security needs, establishing committees that managed everything from resource allocation to educational policy while maintaining the military readiness that had proven essential for survival. Her work in establishing trade relationships with other survivor communities had created an economic network that allowed specialization and resource sharing, with Haven Point's electromagnetic technology being exchanged for food, materials, and skilled personnel from settlements across the recovering nation. The political structures she helped design served as models for other communities seeking to establish sustainable governance systems in the post-apocalyptic world. Diana Torres watched her daughter Hope take her first steps in Haven Point's secure nursery, surrounded by other children whose presence testified to humanity's determination to continue despite the odds stacked against them. Hope's development into a healthy, curious toddler symbolized the future that all survivors were working to create, while Diana's role as head of Haven Point's medical services demonstrated how ordinary people had been transformed by necessity into the heroes their new world required. The memorial wall bearing Miguel's name alongside dozens of other fallen defenders served as a constant reminder of the sacrifices that had made their current security possible, while also inspiring continued vigilance against the threats that still lurked beyond their protected borders. The final confrontation with Vincent Cross came not through military action, but through the power of organized survivor communities working together, as radio intelligence revealed that Cross had established a fortified base in the ruins of Salt Lake City, where he continued to threaten smaller settlements. The coordinated response involved 6 major survivor communities sharing resources and personnel to mount an expedition that would eliminate Cross's threat permanently, demonstrating the kind of inter-community cooperation that offered hope for large-scale civilization recovery. Devin Mitchell led reconnaissance missions that provided crucial intelligence about Cross's remaining forces, while Harold Morrison's wilderness expertise proved invaluable in planning approach routes that avoided both walker concentrations and raider patrol patterns. The decisive battle against Cross's final stronghold showcased how far survivor communities had evolved since the early days of the outbreak, with coordinated tactics, advanced technology, and superior numbers overwhelming the raider forces that had once seemed unstoppable. Cross himself fell during the final assault, not to walker bites or heroic last stands, but to the overwhelming force of organized human society reclaiming territory from chaos and brutality. The victory established Haven Point and its allied communities as the dominant power across the former Mountain West region, controlling trade routes and communication networks that connected isolated survivor groups while providing security for rebuilding efforts. Emma stood on Haven Point's highest observation platform as the sun set over the Colorado Plains, watching as agricultural teams returned from fields that stretched to the horizon while construction crews worked to expand the settlement's residential areas to accommodate the steady stream of new arrivals. The radio chatter from other survivor communities carried reports of successful harvests, completed infrastructure projects, and new settlements being established in areas that had been written off as permanently lost to the walker herds. While the infected still roamed vast areas of the former United States, organized humanity now controlled approximately 30% of the continent and was expanding steadily as electromagnetic frequency technology allowed for systematic clearing operations that reclaimed territory mile by mile. The world would never be the same as it had been before the outbreak, but humanity had not only survived its greatest trial, but had begun building something new and potentially better from the ruins of the old civilization, proving that hope and determination could triumph over even the darkest challenges that fate could devise.